In 1884 to 1885, the European powers were engaged in keen competitions over African territories or African lands. The major factor was the rivalry over Congo. The Portuguese wanted to occupy Congo, and they were supported by the British. The Belgians and the French, they opposed that idea. To prevent the European tribes from going into a war, the Vice Chancellor of Germany, called Otto von Bismarck, decided to invite all the European powers that were interested to occupy lands in Africa, invite Germany. The powers that attended this conference, it includes British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, and the Portuguese, likewise the Belgians. The scramble for and the partitions of the great continent called Africa. This was the competitions among European powers to occupy lands in Africa, and the subsequent divisions of Africa among the European tribes. It came into existence as a result of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The European powers were interested in occupying lands in Africa because Africa was blessed with too much of natural resources, gold, silver, and diamond, strong men and women here in Africa. All European powers, such as the British, the German, the French, the Belgians, and the Italians, all of them had an interest here in Africa during those times. In fact, at some point, the Europeans were about to venture into what they call a conflict, because all of them had an interest in Congo and Niger. Congo is a country in Africa blessed with natural resources, iron, silvers, diamonds. The Germans, the French, the Italians, and the Portuguese, all of them had an interest in this country referred to as Congo during those times. The Portuguese claims of owning a country called Congo, and they were supported by the British. The Germans and the French opposed the Portuguese claim. To prevent these European tribes to venture into a war, the Vice Chancellor of Germany, called Otto von Bismarck, decided to invite all the European powers who were interested to occupy or to own land here in Africa during that time. The Africans were never aware. The European powers converged in Germany, Berlin, in 1884. The map of Africa was brought out, then Africa was parceled out, divided into 54 odd nations, and Africa had never been the same again. Our African leaders who stood on their feet to fight against European powers, to fight against colonialism, to fight against Europeans taking over their lands, their natural resources, they were executed. That's why in Congo, 12 millions of Congolese were executed by the Germans. So this was the scramble for and the partitions. After enslaving the Africans for a period of 400 years, the Europeans were never tired, because all of them wanted to become world superpower. And to become world superpower, you need to colonize more lands. The more lands you colonize, the more powerful you become. To become a world superpower, you must have large amount of colonies here in Africa. That is why the greatest continent that ever existed in the surface of this earth was parceled out into 50 odd nations, and this continent had never been the same again. After the scramble for and the partitions of Africa, the French had the largest colonies here in Africa. Senegal was colonized by the French, Cameroon colonized by the French, Mali, Guinea-Conakry colonized by the French, Burkina Faso the French. Most of the countries in Africa were colonized by the French, and they introduced a system called assimilations, which means they want to transform the African people into Frenchmen. And their headquarters at that time was in Senegal. That's why during the colonial period, when a person was born in Gorée, Saint Louis, Dakar, and Brefesi, he or she is considered to have equal rights with those born in France. Then came the British. In West Africa, they colonized the Gambia even before the scramble and partitions, because an island called James Island was captured by the British. An island called Makati was captured by the British, even well before the scramble and partitions. Ghana was colonized by the British. We have Liberia, of course, was under the control of the British. Nigeria as well. Some of the countries in Africa were colonized by the British, and they introduced a system of administration called the indirect road system. This was a system used by the British to rule our African colonies with the use of our local traditional rulers. Africa, or the Gambia, and many West African countries or African countries were colonized by the British for a period of 400 years. And that's why during those times in this country was divided into two sectors: the Crown Colony and the Protectorate. The indirect rule system was introduced in the Protectorate, while in the colony, the system of direct rule system was introduced. Most of the countries here in Africa that were colonized by the European tribes, they introduced their own system of administration. as a result of the scramble and partitions. That was why in Guinea-Bissau, which was colonized by the Portuguese, they introduced a system called assimilations. And those who passed their trials or their exams were called assimilados, those who failed were called natives. And even those times, the Africans were not allowed to move from one part of Africa to another, because if you are required to move, you must have a past. You must have a past. But prior to that coming in Africa, African people were living large, free to move from one part of a country to another. No disturbance, no segregation here in Africa. That's why it was called the land of the black people, Sudan. But when the European came, they took everything that belongs to the African people. It was in the Bali conference when African countries or leaders were not even informed. The European powers converged in Bali. The map of Africa was later brought out. Then Africa was chosen and divided into 54 odd nations among the European tribes. What are the factors that precipitated the scramble for anti-partitions? What was the motive behind dividing Africa into 50 odd nations? There are many contributing factors. There are many reasons why the Europeans were inspired, were motivated to divide the African lands among the European powers. Because Germans want to become world superpower. Britain equally want to become world superpower. That's why after the First World War in 1814 or 1914, or in fact during the First World War, the African people were recruited as soldiers. They were given arms and ammunition to go and fight for their own colonial masters. When some of them came back, they realized that the Europeans were not strong than the black people. The black people started to fight for their own independence. Most of them were executed by the European powers. And in fact, as a result, or after the scramble for anti-partitions, the Prime Minister of Congo, Patrice Emery Lumumba, was executed by the Germans, King Leopold II. Most of the prominent African leaders were killed by the European tribes. One of the reasons why Africa was divided by the European powers between the British, the French, the German, the Belgians, and the Italians was economic imperialism. All the European powers, they want to become world superpower. They want to stabilize their economy. And to stabilize their economy, they must have colonies here in Africa. The more lands and territories and resources you got at that time, the more powerful you become. Even their guns were made out of African resources. To make their guns, they must have certain resources, and those resources are found here in Africa. Economic imperialism. They cannot be in Europe and then become world superpower. They have to come here in Africa and loot and steal our natural resources. Take these resources and manufacture them to guns. As a result, one can become a world superpower. It was Africa that made Europeans to become world superpower. Without Africa, Germany will never emerge. Without Africa, Britain will never emerge. White man's body was also another motive behind the scramble for anti-partitions. The Europeans had this concept that they were superior to the black people. They had a divine guardians to rule the African people, which in fact motivated the Europeans, the British, the French, the Italians, the Germans, and the Portuguese to came down to the coast of Africa, parcel out Africa into 54 odd nations, because they believed they were superior to the black people as a result of the color of their skin. Little did they know that the Africans were the first people that ever existed in the surface of this earth, were the black people. For them, they thought that because of the color of their skins, and in fact, they were superior than the black people, that they had a divine guidance to rule our ancestors, which motivated them to come down to Africa, and then took our ancestors. They did not stop there. They finally divided our continent into different sections. Lack of space in Europe was also another factor that precipitated the scramble for anti-partitions. In Europe at that time, the European powers, they were unable to live together because they are European tribes. The British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Italians, they were tribes. They were unable to live together in peace and harmony in Europe, which in fact motivated them to come down to Africa and occupy our lands and allow some of their people to come down and then settle here in Africa. Which was the reason why even right now, the Europeans or some of the British are still in South Africa, because they never want to leave Africa. Which was the reason why Mandela was in prison for 27 years in Robben Island. Most of our African people, they suffered in the hands of the European tribes. Because at that time, there was no space in Europe for all the European tribes to live together without any problems or without any difficulties. which in fact was another contributing factors why the European came and took the lands from the African people as their very own. In search of raw material was also another contributing factors why the European came to Africa. Because Africa was blessed and still blessed with natural resources. Diamonds, iron ore, silvers, bauxite were many here in Africa. For America or for Europe, there was no raw materials there. And in fact, for them to have raw material for their industries as a result of the industrial revolutions in Europe at that time, which in fact led to the abolition of slave trade, they have to come to Africa and occupy lands in Africa. That's why the reason why, in fact, that led to the scramble and partition. The main reason was a rivalry in Congo. Because all the European powers, they had an interest into this little country called Congo, which was blessed with natural resources. It motivated them to come down to Africa and then took whatever belonged to the African people. Because Africa was blessed with natural resources. That's why we had the greatest empire that ever emerged in the planet. The Mali Empire, the Ghana Empire, which was in fact called the Gold Coast. Why? Because it was blessed with too much of gold. The European came in search of raw materials. They needed raw materials for their industries, because without these raw materials, their industries would never survive. And the only place where they can have this raw material was in Africa. That's why they came rustling and they divided Africa into 54 odd nations. They do not stop there. Whenever African leaders stood on the feet to fight for the independence or for the salvation of the black people, he is silent. And to silence African leaders meant to kill them. Some were poisoned, they died. Some were gunned down, they died. Some were mutilated, some as part of this memory movement were executed. Most of the African people were executed. They would instigate their fellow Africans to fight for a particular African leader. And of course, you are forcefully removed in power. The other factor which motivated or which in fact precipitated the coming of Europeans to Africa, which led to the scramble for and the partitions of Africa, was desire to occupy lands in Africa. The more lands they occupy, the more powerful they become. That's why in West Africa, the French colonized the largest colonies here in West Africa. They emerged as a powerful state, France. They captured Senegal and it was colonized. Mali was captured and colonized. Then Burkina Faso was captured and then colonized. You go to Guinea-Conakry, of course colonized by the French. They are the European tribe that had the largest colonies here in West Africa, then followed by the British. Germans, they were the last to come and they were the first to leave. The Germans decolonized and captured a country called Tanganyika, by then and now called Tanzania, was colonized by the Germans, and they introduced a system called paternalism. And in this system, they thought that they were very superior, or they were more superior to the black people, the Germans. These are some of the factors which motivated, which precipitated the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. But prior to or before the scramble for and the partitions, some countries in Africa were already being colonized or captured. The only countries in Africa that were never part of the scramble and partitions were Liberia and Ethiopia. However, they tried to occupy Ethiopia. The people of Ethiopians were able to unite and they fought against the European tribes, and Europeans were defeated in the battle called Adowa. That's why Ethiopia was never colonized. For Liberia, it was a trade, so it was a settlement. That's why it was not part of the scramble and partition. It was a place whereby liberated slaves or the slaves were encamped after the abolition of slavery. That's why it was never colonized. So these are the only two countries that were never colonized by the European powers, were Ethiopia and Liberia. It was in this Berlin conference that the European powers, they made an agreement to occupy lands in Africa. And those European powers who were interested to occupy lands in Africa, they all combined in Berlin, 1884 and 1885, which was organized by Otto von Bismarck to prevent European powers from going into what he called a war. But African leaders were not invited. No African countries was invited to attend this Berlin conference. This was how Africa was demarcated into 54 odd countries, and as a result, the Africans now started to speak different European language because they were colonized by different European powers. But Africans should know this. Prior to the coming of the European, the Africa was called the land of the black people. That's why the Africans could travel from one place to another. The Arabs were coming from North Africa to West Africa. People were leaving or moving from East Africa to South Africa. without no disturbance prior to the coming of the Europeans. But without having to divide Africa into these nations, Africa will emerge as world superpower, because Africa is the largest continent in the entire universe, rich with natural resources. When Africa was divided, the African people were stripped from their own language. The African people were stripped from their own culture, because any European tribes that occupy lands in Africa, they will introduce their system of administration, introduce their culture. Now, in this Berlin conference, European powers reached some agreement. They decided to reach some decisions, or some decisions were reached. Because when the Germans, the Portuguese, the Belgians, the Italians, and the French, they converged in Germany, because they all had an interest here in Africa. So they reached an agreement. Among the agreement reached in the Berlin conference was notifications. It means any European powers who is interested to occupy lands in Africa should inform their fellow European tribes to avoid conflict. For instance, when the British had an interest to colonize the Gambia, the British should inform all the European tribes about their interest in Africa. That was called notifications. The other agreement or decisions which was reached in the Berlin conference among all the European powers was abolitions of slavery and slave trade, which means any European tribe that is interested to occupy a particular land or territories in Africa should make sure that they put an end to slavery and slave trade. Which was the reason why when Africa was divided as a result of scramble and partition, the slave trade was finally put to an end, because it was an agreement of decisions reached by all the European powers in Germany, Berlin. Social and economic reforms was also another decisions that all the European powers agreed upon in Berlin in 1884 to 1885. Because during those times in Africa, there were nothing like hospitals, there were nothing like schools. If they were here in Africa, but they were not many, they were not even up to standards. So the European tribes, they agreed that any European powers that occupy or colonize a particular territory in Africa should make sure that they build schools, they build roads, hospitals, and other infrastructures. That's why when the British colonized the Gambia, in Batos, they invited the Christian missionaries such as the Quakers, the Anglican, the Roman Catholics, and the Methodists, who finally established schools here in this country. It was also another agreement reached in the Berlin Conference among the European powers in 1884. The other agreement which was reached among all the European powers in Berlin was freedom of Congo and Niger. Because the main reason that used to be Berlin Conference on the scramble and partitions was Congo. Because Congo was blessed with natural resources. So it was agreed that all the European powers should free to move or should free to go to Congo at any point in time. It was not restricted to any European powers. So Congo and Niger was a free trade area for all the European powers in order to prevent them from going from having a conflict among themselves. These are some of the agreements or the decisions that were reached in the Berlin Conference. If not these decisions, then it would have been what they call a war among all the European powers. When all this was agreed among the European powers, they started now coming to Africa now. They came to Africa by sea, all the European powers. The British, they went to the side where they have an interest upon, the French, the German, the Belgians, and the Italians. They used certain methods or strategies to occupy territories in Africa. They used methods and strategies to occupy Africa, because in Africa at that time, some of our African leaders were very strong and agile. They were not in line with European powers. So for them to colonize Africa, some of them, they had to use what they call treaties and peaceful negotiations. They had to use gunboat diplomacy. They had to come with their soldiers to threaten our African people, for them to surrender, and finally for them to occupy our African lands. One of the strategies deployed by the Europeans to occupy lands in Africa was treaties and peaceful negotiations. Some of them, when they came to Africa, they confronted our African kings and chiefs. They made negotiation arrangement, treaties and peaceful negotiation. They negotiated with our African leaders, and finally, some of our African leaders were able to grant Europeans the freedom to occupy their lands. This was negotiation and peaceful treaty. They will use peaceful means and negotiate with our African people during that time. And African people have to surrender and give our lands to the European powers, and which some of the African or European powers or African countries were colonized for a period of 400 years, just like the Gambia. Only 2 schools were built for 400 years. Only 2 hospitals were built for 400 years here in Gambia. And they also use what they call military conquest, outright military conquest. when they use the peaceful means to occupy African lands, if they are not successful, then they will use what they call violence, military conquest. Because for them at that time, they were having cannons and cannonballs, superior weapons. They will come with their soldiers and encamp at a particular place, then attack our African people. That's why Samori Toure fought until he died. Because for Samori was one of the first Africans to fight a modern war with the use of modern military equipment and tactics. He resisted against European colonizing the territory of Samori for too long, with little or no support from African leaders, and finally he surrendered and he was captured and executed. That was outright and military conquest. These are the methods used by the Europeans to occupy or to conquer African lands. They use peaceful negotiation and treaties. If that is not successful, then they use outright military conquest by bringing their guns to threaten our African people. Of course, they have to surrender because Africans at that time were not having modern weapons or superior weapons. Bows and arrows, cutlasses and stones, spears is what the African people were having. And as a result, the Europeans were able to conquer our land and divide the African countries or continent into or among European powers. As a result of scramble and partitions, it promoted colonialism. Because of the division of Africa among European powers, promoted, it would finally lead to what he called colonialism, the indirect political rule of a country by a foreign state, which was called colonialism. Each and every country colonized or captured by the Europeans, they colonized those countries for a long period of time. The Germans captured Tanzania, then called Tanganyika. The Portuguese captured Guinea-Bissau and introduced what they call assimilations. The French captured Senegal and introduced assimilations. The British captured the Gambia and introduced indirect rule system. In Cameroon, it was by the French. In Guinea-Conakry, it was by the French. In Ghana, it was by the British. Most of the African people, or in fact all the African countries except Liberia and Ethiopia, were colonized by the European powers and they used their system of administration. Some countries were ruled for 400 years by the European powers, with little development, with hardship. That's why at some point came in the early 1960s, African people were tired as a result of colonialism. They started to agitate for their independence, African people. Africans started to gain their political independence in the early 1960s. That's why came a man called Kwame Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister of Ghana, who fought for the independence of Ghana, and finally in 1957, Ghana was the first West African countries to gain their political independence. He inspired and motivated many West African people to fight for their own freedom. That's why came nationalism. The Africans who stood on their feet to say no to European imperialism were called nationalists. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria was a nationalist. Sir Melton Magai was among the Africans who fight against European imperialism or colonialism. Tafawa Balewa too was among the African people who say no to colonialism. Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau was also among the African people who say no to colonialism. Then Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Nelson Mandela of South Africa, which was the reason why he was in prison at Robben Island for a period of 27 years because he said no to apartheid regime here in Africa. Then came Sekou Touré of Guinea-Conakry, was a nationalist. In Gambia, Kairaba Jawara. Senegal, it was Léopold Sédar Senghor. We have Julius Kambarage Nyerere. These were all African people who fought against European powers. And 1960, then came Nigeria, gained her political independence. Mali also attained her political independence or freedom. Then Guinea-Bissau also attained her political independence. African countries started to gain their political independence in the 1960s. And the Gambia, 18 February 1965, attained her political independence from the hand of the colonial masters, the British. The Gambia was the last English-speaking country in West Africa to attain her political independence. And this was a time when African people say bye to colonialism and European imperialism. This was the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. When Africa then was called the land of the black people, Sudan, there was what he called trans-Saharan trade between the Arabs and the people of West Africa. Africans were able to move from one part of Africa to another. It was one continent called Sudan. Now we have different countries. Even small countries now, they want to be independent. That's why Africa now, they speak foreign language. That's why Africa now, they attend Western education. Africans were ripped from their culture. Everything that was in Africa was taken by the European powers. So this was scrambled for and practiced. Watch these videos here or our history playlist.